We are doing a lecture series, 4 lectures followed by a 5th event, a culminating event, that focus on the history of iconoclasm, which broadly means image destruction, although we problematized that term a little bit last time, and we're going to do more of the same this time, because now we're actually dealing with the language that the term comes from, right? The Byzantines spoke Greek. It's going to get very, very complicated very, very quickly. And iconoclasm, of course, is derived from Greek roots, even though, as you'll see, the Byzantines didn't call this iconoclasm. Byzantine iconoclasm is our focus this week. 2 weeks ago, we focused on Egyptian iconoclasm, and this continues our sort of trans-historical march towards the current day. In a few weeks, we will tackle Reformation iconoclasm, and then the final lecture, which will be at the end of March, will focus on secular iconoclasm, specifically focused on political image destruction from the French Revolution through to today. Although, as I alluded to last time, the focus of that lecture will spend a little bit more time in the 20th century than in the 21st century. And we'll particularly focus on some of the post-Soviet conversations around sculptures that have happened in Russia. The final event is a design charrette, right? And that charrette will focus on what Jacksonville can do in engaging in conversations around sculptures that are contested. Because at the core of this lecture series is a very simple observation, which is that we are not the first people in the history of the world to wonder what to do with sculptures that not everyone likes very much. This is not a 21st century issue. This is a human issue. And that is what we're attempting to excavate through this lecture series. We're trying to create a historical basis for understanding how to treat images and symbols that have these strong and contested meanings, and how different societies have grappled with those issues. So that design charrette, that culminating experience, gives you a voice in helping us determine how we might come up with different design solutions for some of our own contested monuments. And I give sort of a wink and a nod to what those might look like at the end of each lecture, trying to apply some of the lessons that you will learn tonight, some of the lessons that you learned last time, to, in particular, what we're discussing here is the sculpture, the monument to Confederate soldiers, to fallen Confederate soldiers in Hemming. Okay? Now, I want to emphasize, as I did at the first lecture, that this is a nonpartisan lecture series. The Cumber Museum of Art and Gardens has no position on this. I, as the director of the Art Museum, have no position on this. I, as a citizen, might, right? And I suspect all of you do too, and you should. But it is the Cumber Museum of Art and Gardens' job not to proselytize, right? Not to evangelize, but to act as a platform for civic discourse, which is something which is sorely missing in the 21st century. And in point of fact, I did not share this last time, but the Pew Charitable Trust does a survey of the most trusted institutions in America every 2 years. It's a biennial survey. And the results are that the most trusted institutions in America are libraries and museums, more than universities, more than religious organizations, more than the media. That is something that we must jealously guard. So my objective tonight is to give you a historical basis for understanding the problems, the challenges, and the opportunities that we face in our present day. But I will not opine on the best design solution. That is not my place. Oh, and by the way, you can come to the design charrette if and only if you come to at least 2 lectures. So part of civic discourse is informing yourself. And I will do my best to do that in the remaining time that I have. This is a lecture. You'll see this. This is a detail of a manuscript. We'll talk a little bit more about it on a subsequent slide. But before we dive into Byzantine iconoclasm, let me start by recapping where we ended last time. This is what we are building towards in this lecture, sort of key takeaways. And because I am a Romanist and a Byzantinist, I couldn't help myself. Egypt got 3 takeaways. You're going to get 4 tonight. 33% more takeaways. Imagine. And a glass of wine. How lucky are you? And if you came from the beach, no traffic on the way in. So the three main takeaways of our Egyptian lecture series were, number one, iconoclasm takes several forms in ancient Egypt, but is consistent across millennia. So we talked about tomb robbers. We talked about politically motivated iconoclasm. We talked about religious iconoclasm, although political and religious iconoclasm weren't easily dissociable. But the one consistent theme that we saw is from the Old Kingdom, and here we have our sculpture of Irkapta, which is in the exhibition, all the way through to the Roman period and the later periods of Egyptian history. If you recall, we were going through 642 AD through the Islamic conquest. You see intentional image destruction as a consistent practice. Second, images in ancient Egypt derive their power from a cosmology that literally imagines a sculpture as living. This is not to say they thought images sort of resembled the people that they depicted and therefore were imbued with power. No. The sculpture was literally alive. Egyptians had a very different conception of the soul. The soul had 5 different parts, and one of the parts of the soul animated the sculpture. It literally needed to eat and drink. This is why in ancient Egyptian tombs, you literally had to bring offerings of food and water to lay in front of the sculpture every day. It was very expensive to die in ancient Egypt. And finally, sculptures are individually identifiable based on one of 2 things: likeness, and we looked at sort of the evolution of the image of Horus across 3,000 years and how consistent that image of a falcon remained up until sort of the Hellenistic period, or inscription, or an actual set of words or symbols, right, hieroglyphs in this case, that identified the individual. So this will become incredibly important in this lecture as we struggle a little bit, only for one slide, but struggle a little bit to figure out if an image depicts Christ or not. You'll see that this is actually not a trivially easy thing to do, particularly when you're talking about the early church. So these are your 3 takeaways. You're going to get 4 new ones tonight, although you will see that particularly on this question of likeness, right, we're going to spend a little bit more time meditating. Those of you remember, my very sophisticated slide explaining to you what iconoclasm means, right? This is what you get a PhD for. You break a word apart and you tell people what something means. So iconoclasm literally sort of means image breaking, right? Klasm sort of means breaking in Greek. And icon, as we discussed, is slightly more complicated than this idea of image, right? We spoke last time about that inflation of that term, how you can click on icons on your desktop now. It's obviously something more than just an image. But image is not really a great translation. It loses something, because what icon actually means in Greek and what it meant in the Byzantine period is it meant something more like the idea of likeness. It wasn't just a drawing of something. It was actually capturing an essence of a thing in physical form. And one of the topics that we're going to come back to over and over and over again in this lecture is this notion of likeness and its relationship to presence. And the seminal text on this was written by a German named Hans Belting, in German, if you really want to have a fun time, 1,000 pages of German, but translated in 1994 as well. And it is sort of best translated into English as Likeness and Presence, and you can't read it there, but it's a history of the image in the era before art, okay? Or before the era of art. So Belting's premise is that once you develop the idea of art, you strip out this idea of spirituality, which was inherent in object production, effectively before the Renaissance. This is something that, although we think of medieval art as spiritual because it's not realistic, right? It is true that even back into ancient Greece, when you have naturalistic or idealized sculpture, there were notions of animism. There were notions that there were literally spirits that were resident in sculptures. And as we saw in some of the slides last time, ancient Egyptian style and form chose hieratic compositions, chose more abstract compositions, but artists could be incredibly realistic and incredibly naturalistic. It was a choice. It wasn't an absence of ability that causes Egyptian art to look the way that it does. So Belting puts his finger on something very important, which is that through this idea of likeness, images were imbued with the presence of the individual depicted. Now, Belting himself makes an important distinction here, and this is one that it's just important to bracket for the purposes of this lecture, because you can only do so much in 50 minutes, which is actually incidentally part of the reason civil discourse is really not something that we do a very good job of in this country, because we think we can do it through 500-word sound bites. 50 minutes isn't enough. But he distinguishes between images of individuals and what you would call in art history narrative images, images of scenes. And I actually think there's an important point worth calling out for our discussion of image destruction and iconoclasm. And you'll see an example of it, not in a narrative scene, but we actually saw it in our Egyptian lecture series. If you remember, there was a relief that we showed of Akhenaten making an offering to the Aten sun disk. And he was accompanied by a young girl. And while Akhenaten's face was destroyed, and all the inscriptions, including his name, which included Aten, that sort of idolatrous deity, right, that's terrible deity, all of the references to Aten in hieroglyphs were destroyed, the little girl's face wasn't destroyed. The power of an image usually isn't derived from the scene depicted. It's derived from people's perception of a person or a deity in that scene. That's an interesting thought, right? That the power of an image, even if it's a very complicated image, usually derives from the presence of a single disliked person, not from the entirety of what's being depicted. It's really interesting. And there are sort of biblical precedents for that, right? You can worship an idol and you can still be saved, right? It's the idol which is the evil thing. And that's actually something that we'll come back to, this idea between theology and theory and practice, and how easily corruptible people can be when there's sort of nuanced theology that allows for image veneration. I also should point out here that though we talk about iconoclasm and Byzantine iconoclasm, that term, iconoclasm, is a later term. And this is something that, again, you will see over and over through this lecture, is this anachronistic, backwards-looking. The fancy historical term is teleological, looking backwards, using the ends to justify the means. We call this a period of Byzantine iconoclasm. That is not what the Byzantines called it. They actually called it iconomachia. They called it icon war, like a battle over images. It was about contestation. It wasn't about breaking versus not breaking. And then we have all sorts of really funny words for people who like images. Iconolators, iconojewels, and the one that sort of makes most sense, is most legible on its surface, is iconophiles. Right? So I'll use those things sort of interchangeably, but iconophiles is probably the most intelligible one. So that's what we mean by iconoclasm, right? We mean image breaking, although, as we've already seen, right, the Byzantines had sort of a different sense of what iconoclasm was, had a different sense of what an image was than we do today, and we need to unpack that a little bit more, and we will as we explore how iconoclasm played itself out in the Byzantine period. So what do we mean by Byzantine? All right, well, this is really complicated. So we mean a really, really long period, not as long as ancient Egypt, but a really long period. We mean a period running from AD 330 to AD 1453. Now again, I will repeat, what's with the dates? All of you, so many of you raised your hands, but for those of you who weren't here, right, we are talking about, in this lecture in particular, a moment of history which is focused in the lecture itself squarely on Christianity. Right? Now, you can make an argument that you could use Common Era before Common Era, CE or BCE, but the pivot point is still 0. Right? It is my sense as a scholar of early Christianity that when that pivot point, right, the birth of Christ, remains sort of the swing, that it's probably appropriate, particularly in a lecture on early Christianity, to use AD and BC. It's a personal preference. It's not a general statement of fact. If you were using a different calendar, if you're using an Islamic calendar, that would not be appropriate. You would use an AH date starting at a different period. Okay, so you'll see me use AD throughout, right? It's not a judgment of anything. It's just a reflection of the subject matter that we're discussing tonight and my academic background. Okay? We're not going to touch anything with a BC date other than the Ur-Coptis sculpture that you saw. So we're talking about a period that ranges some 1,100 years, 1,100 plus years. And it is bounded on one end by the founding of Constantinople, and bounded on the other end by the fall of Constantinople. Now, we were able to get fairly precise, if you'll recall, in our ancient Egyptian lecture. There were pretty good records of pharaohs we could get within a few years. Right? Constantinople was founded on the 11th of May, 330, and Constantinople fell on the 29th of May, 1453. The record keeping gets much, much better the closer that you get to the contemporary moment. Constantinople was founded by a guy who didn't think anything of himself at all. He just named the capital of his empire after himself, Constantine. Constantine I and/or Constantine the Great. We'll talk a little bit about how he rose to power on the next slide, but he became the emperor of the entire Roman Empire. Again, we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, in 306. And then through a series of sort of brilliant military victories, came to unify the empire. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I lied. In 306, he became Caesar, and he unified the whole empire in 324 after defeating Maxentius and Licinius. But through that period, showed increasing inclinations towards Christianity. He did not convert to Christianity until he dies on his deathbed in 337. But one of the sort of seminal moments in early Christian history is when he allows for Christianity to be openly practiced in what is called the Edict of Milan, or the Edict of Toleration. That's in 313. And he convenes the first ecumenical council in Nicaea. Some people say Nicaea, Nicaea, in 325. Okay, so he's very interested in theology. He's very interested in making sure that his empire, while it allows for Christianity and he is inclined towards Christianity, really is relatively open. The only people he didn't like very much were people who opposed him. So he is, St. Constantine, but when he dispatches Licinius, he has no problem dispatching Licinius' 12-year-old son, Licinius II, as well. Right? So he's a historical figure. Everyone has a textured and interesting history. There would be some people who would think Constantine not so great, right? But Constantine the Great is how we remember him. Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed II comes in on the 29th of May and defeats what is at that point not an empire, right? Constantinople from the 12th century on is basically a city-state that flexes its muscle more or less, but it's really not a major player in the world, although Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's now called, if you've ever been there, is incredibly defensible. Right? It is basically a peninsula jutting out into water with cliffs on three sides. It is a very difficult place to take. So it lasts for quite some time, and of course had a degree of concentrated wealth that allowed it to do so, not so much through military might, but through sort of interesting tactics and alliances. The emperor at the time that it falls is Constantine the 11th, Paleologos, so you can see the endurance of the name. And as we spoke about last time, how power, even if it is not genetically derived, can be conceived through affinity or similarity that can be brought on by shared naming. Okay. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the Byzantine period. Although, as I mentioned last time, and we'll emphasize again, if you walked into Constantinople or anywhere else that was under Byzantine control anytime during this period and said, so tell me what it's like to be a Byzantine, they would look at you as if you had four heads and they would say, what's that? The Byzantines thought of themselves as Romans, Eastern Romans. They called themselves Romans. They called themselves Romanitas right up until 1453, right? I mean, just to benchmark you to what's going on in the rest of the world, Columbus sails in 1492. Now, incidentally, the reason that Columbus sails and sails this direction in 1492 is because the Ottomans don't want to let ships go east anymore from Spain. So the first coast, which is something we probably shouldn't unironically call this place. Oh, there we go. Don't worry. I should have had one. So the first coast, right, owes something to the fact that Constantinople fell. And look at that, just like that. We're almost there. We're back. Let's try. Can you just pop it forward on the screen? It's okay. Got it. Look at that. Technology. It's because I'm a millennial. It wouldn't have worked for anyone else just because I'm a millennial. So that's the chronological definition of the Byzantine Empire, right? You can see, for those of you who were last time, we're sort of tracing sort of the same architecture for the lecture. So now let's talk about geographically what we mean by the Byzantine Empire. So one of the most famous questions in sort of history that you can get on history tests, and they've been on tests for 200 years, is the history of Europe, of modern Europe, begins in 284 AD. Discuss. Now, the reason for that is in 284 AD, a very clever, very vicious, but very clever emperor named Diocletian decides he's going to split the empire, the Roman Empire, into two halves, the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. And the line that separates these things is the border between Italy and Slovenia, Croatia, all the way up. So Diocletian's choice, maybe it was predicated on the presence of the Julian Alps, right? You can argue that there's some ecological boundary, but it is basically the difference between Eastern and Western Europe today. And that indeed plays itself out over the course of the Byzantine period. Now, so what you see here is you see a map which shows the quote-unquote Eastern Roman Empire, right, split. So Diocletian, right, separates Eastern from Western here. But as power is concentrated in Constantinople, particularly in the 5th and 6th centuries, right, this becomes the general orbit of the Eastern Empire, whereas the Western Empire is under Rome's orbit through 476 when it falls, and then it gets separated into various empires, various barbarian empires, and then eventually sort of degrees of consolidation, most notably for the purposes of this lecture, under the Carolingian Empire. Now, I should say that the Byzantine Empire was always deeply concerned with its relationship with the papacy, its relationship with Rome, and making sure that it exerted as much control over Italy as it could. So through the 7th century, you have emperors who successfully lead incursions onto the Italian peninsula and hold land. So for those of you who are ever in Venice, I would encourage you to go an hour out of your way, go an hour south to a place called Ravenna, which was the Byzantine capital on the Italian peninsula. It's a remarkable place with unbelievable Byzantine remains, mosaics, churches, etc. But after the 7th century, especially with the rise of Islam, it's very difficult to fight any war, no matter when you're alive, on two fronts. And the Western ground is sort of forfeited as the focus for the Byzantine Empire turns increasingly eastward. And that, again, will bear on the conversation for this evening. So the Byzantine Empire, more or less, right, centered in modern-day Istanbul and Turkey, right, but basically is the equivalent of Eastern Europe today. And indeed, the forms of Christianity that are practiced today map pretty neatly onto those boundaries as well. So we know what Byzantine is. We know what iconoclasm is. So when was Byzantine iconoclasm? Well, unlike Egypt, where iconoclasm was a transhistorical phenomenon which can be documented for 3,500 years, Byzantine iconoclasm, by which we mean a historically documented, although we'll see how much, period of image destruction, is really much more confined. We have two periods of image destruction. The first, only for 57 years. It sort of, again, depends how you date it. Someone would say it's 47 years. Some people would say it's 51 years. But dating more or less from 730 to 787. So why the distinction between sort of 47, right, or sorry, 57 and 61 years? So I date it starting in 730 because the emperor at the time, a guy named Leo III, in 730, signs an edict that outlaws image veneration. He does it without consulting the patriarch, a guy named Germanos at the time, and it precipitates the conflict that we now call iconoclasm. Leo III begins his reign in 726, so some people would date it to 726, although it takes him a few years to decide that what he ought to do is he ought to ban images. Now, why on earth would he do that? There's a long history of image veneration in the Catholic Church. Right? There is a long history at this point, 4 centuries worth of history of image veneration in the Eastern Orthodox Church, including in and around Constantinople. Constantine literally imported images from all over the empire. There is an icon of Christ above the gate where you enter the royal palace, called the Chalke Gate. I mean, it is so ingrained. Why would Leo III think about banning image worship? And there are a few different theories for this, and there aren't really any good sources. We have very detailed sources about dates, and we have very detailed sources about how terrible Leo III is, written by iconophiles. But we don't have really good iconoclast sources. Because even though it's the iconoclasts who are accused of this widespread image destruction, 57 years out of 1100 is not very long. It's pretty clear who won in history. So we don't have great sources. The source material that survives is written by the people who like icons, and they make Leo seem like a really bad guy. But there were some sort of structural things, there were some historical, momentous things going on that could have affected his decision-making. One is the rise of Islam. And there were some military losses that had been incurred early in Leo's reign, and preceding him. And of course, he would have been acutely aware of the success that Islamic forces were having elsewhere. We discussed last time how they swept through North Africa just 100 years prior. Okay? So he's aware of all of this, and he's wondering, what are they doing? What are they doing differently than we are? What are they doing right? And one of the things that they're doing, of course, is there is a provision in Islam, just like in Judaism, against the production of graven images of any sort. Okay, so that's one thing, which maybe, although that is not as widely credited a theory as it once was, but that's one of the things which may have been on his mind. And we know that there was a lot of dialogue between the Arab empires and the Byzantine empires. There were also natural disasters. There was a huge volcanic explosion which resulted in tsunamis throughout the Mediterranean that would have affected Byzantine property, Byzantine territory during exactly this period. So it's possible that he also saw this calamitous event driven by God, right, in sort of the Byzantine cosmology without sort of Byzantine science, or without contemporary science, modern science, and thought to himself, oh gosh, to what do we explain our misfortune? So there are these threads which would cause an emperor to question, what could I do to change my luck? Now this shouldn't seem as far-fetched as it sounds. One of the reasons that it is argued that Constantine became favorable towards Christianity is because in a battle, right, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he's said to have seen the cross in the sky and emblazoned it, right, on banners and on a shield, and in so doing, won the battle. Right? You're always looking for a competitive advantage, and when you believe that competitive advantage comes from above, you do things that you think will appease the people looking out, person or persons looking out for you up above. Okay? So that might explain why we see the advent of Byzantine iconoclasm under Leo III. But what is clear, no matter how you look at it, is Leo III is not the largest offender. The largest offender of iconoclasm, to the extent it's an offense, is a guy named Constantine V. I have to say Byzantine emperors are almost as uninventive in their naming conventions as art historians are in naming things. We just get a lot of alternating Constantines and Leos for a while here. But Constantine V has a spectacularly successful reign by almost any metric. He captures territory, he wards off Islamist invaders, there's a relatively stable economy, but he absolutely was an iconoclast. Felt very, very strongly that iconoclasm was in the best interest, and in fact has a synod, a gathering of bishops, although none from the West participate, in which he gets official sanction. So it's not just an edict, it's not an executive order, right? It's an act of Congress voted along party lines, right? That says image veneration is bad. Okay? So it is not an ecumenical council in the church because it is not representative of all of Christendom. And this is something that you'll see politically is important. Well, we're not going to dwell on it, but it becomes a reason for the overturn of iconoclasm. So iconoclasm ends around 787 when a regent queen, Irene, takes over the throne, and perhaps to develop stronger ties with Rome, which I've already discussed was very important, or perhaps because she was in a tenuous position as a regent with her son not yet ready to take the reins of the empire, she negotiated something which was frankly probably more favorable, certainly was more favorable among Eastern Orthodox bishops, or among the Eastern Orthodox Patriarchate. So it probably was a political chip that she cashed in. So this first period of iconoclasm, can we advance manually?
Do you go backwards?
No, we need to go forward.
Keep going?
Yep. It's not moving on the screen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's moving.
Yeah. So the first period of iconoclasm ends in 787. The next slide is going to show you what iconoclastic church decoration looks like. So iconoclasm doesn't mean no images, it means no images of people. So eventually you're going to see a church called Hagia Irene, right? Irene, not named after that Irene. It was actually the original seat of the Patriarchate in Constantinople. It was the church that Constantine built. It was burned to the ground in the 530s during a revolt under the rule of a guy named Justinian, Justinian I. We'll see a Justinian II. Like I said, the naming is really out of control. So we'll go backwards. So Hagia Irene is burnt to the ground in 532. Then Justinian builds a church on the site in 548. That's the church you're looking at, pre-iconoclastic. But in 740, there's an earthquake. Like I said, all these sort of calamitous events which cause someone to wonder what is going on in the universe. And the church is repaired, and if we go back, backwards, back, forward.
Yeah, no. It's like on a delay, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. And this cross is put up. That cross is put up. So the cross was allowed. Cross is okay. Images of people are not okay. So symbols are okay, but images of holy people are okay. So why would that be the case? Well, we'll come to the theological arguments in a bit more detail later, but the short version of the story is there was this confusion of the presence of the holy in the likeness of the individual. And that caused people to start treating the images as if they were Egyptian. You know, you can learn an awful lot about what Christians think is bad and what Jews think is bad in image veneration by looking at what the Egyptians did, because after all, the second commandment was written in response to Egyptian image worship, right? So Egyptians literally believed the image was alive. In Christian theology, you don't believe the image is alive. You believe the image points you, guides you, is an intercessor to the higher domain where that individual resides. But that's a really nuanced argument. That's a really complicated thing for someone to get. And you see in actual practice, not in theory, that Christians became very confused about that and started treating the image as if it were alive, as if it were the Virgin Mary, as if it were Christ. And that confusion is what caused people to worry that maybe image worship was something that needed to be curtailed. So the cross was fine because it stood for Christ's redemption of mankind. It stood for his suffering. It was the instrument of that suffering, and it was a visual reminder without having to show his physical body. Okay? So we move to the next slide. The second period of iconoclasm breaks out. You can see that we have this relatively short burst of image veneration. And then we have another very short period of iconoclasm from 814 to 843, if you move to the next slide. This is something which, we spoke a little bit about the source material and how the source material of iconoclasm is actually written by people who like images. And you can see, right, this is actually, sorry. Oh, no. You can see that this 12th century manuscript, which is actually in Madrid, postdates iconoclasm by 300 years. right? So it is written by people who love who love images, who are image worshipers. And here you see iconoclasts and iconophiles arguing their case in front of the emperor, recording these historical debates of the second iconoclastic period. There is really no substantive difference in the theological arguments that are made between the first period and the second period of iconoclasm. The most important thing for the purposes of our conversation is to note that it was a relatively unsettled time. And again, in that interregnum, in that sort of 30-year period that separates the two, there were Islamic military victories, right? There was a waning of power in the Byzantine Empire. There was a rediscovery of that synod, of that edict of 754, of that council of 754 that caused people to think, oh, well, only 70 years ago, only 60 years ago, they thought image worship was bad, so maybe we should reinstitute that practice because things aren't working out so well. So really, we should read iconoclasm politically as an indication of an unsettled nature in the Byzantine Empire. Now, the theological arguments that are made are incredibly relevant to us today, and it shows that what iconoclasm is at its core is a political conversation. So if we move to the next. So I think it's important, before we sort of embark on the theological conversations about iconoclasm, to talk a little bit about the fact that if the Byzantines did in fact think of themselves as Romans, then they probably weren't inventing ideas of iconoclasm out of whole cloth. There's a history there. There's a history of image destruction in the Roman Empire, just like there's a history of image destruction in the Egyptian pharaonic period that carries through. So this extends our notion of Byzantine iconoclasm back a few centuries, but I nonetheless think it's important to ground us here. So on the left, you'll see another image on the right in a moment. Thank you. Oh, you can go forward, it's okay. That's good. We're doing the best we can here. It's my fault for dropping this, really. Emily's doing it. A round of applause for Emily, everyone. I don't even know why I'm holding this anymore. That's right, iconoclasm. I was talking about the clicker as an image last time, so maybe. So on the left you see, sometimes called the Severentondo. It's in Berlin now. It dates to 8200, and what you see is the royal family. So the Emperor of the Roman Empire, Septimius Severus, shown with his diadem, with a very interesting beard. Make note of that beard. You'll see something like it in just a little bit. He was North African originally, with his Syrian wife, very cosmopolitan, Julia Domna, and their two children, Caracalla, who is smiling at you at your lower right, and Geta, poor Geta. So Geta, as Caracalla's brother, older brother, they co-rule together, and it's disastrous. They can't even meet in person because they're afraid the other is going to assassinate them. So Caracalla says, enough of this, let's meet in mother's chamber, and we'll hash this out, and it will be done. And he had his centurions kill him in his mother's arms. So Caracalla is not the best guy in Roman history, but after succeeding the throne, issues what is called, and this is a very well-known phenomenon in ancient Rome, a damnatio memoriae, literally a damning of memory, which is a purge of all images of an individual that are known. So he's literally erased from the family photo, right? It's like taking a picture of someone you don't like and cutting them out of your friend group. But his public sculptures are also destroyed as well, and we have vanishingly few examples of what he looks like in the archaeological record. So this is a long history, and when we think about iconoclasm and when people wrote about iconoclasm early on, this is what they imagined, right? They imagined this wholesale purge. Theophanes the Confessor, an iconophile who's writing about that iconoclast emperor, Constantine V, talks about how he goes after the monasteries and he takes images and he throws them into the sea. I mean, it's all a bit hyperbolic, right? We still have images from this period, right? It's unclear, and there's some great scholars who have done work recently to show that iconoclasm may have been official policy, but that doesn't mean that it made it all the way to the extent of the Byzantine Empire. People practice what they practice, right? All of us believe in something. There are very few of us who carry that orthodoxy all the way to the extreme without making any exceptions. Right? So people do what they do. There's always a variation and practice. So on the right, we have an image of Isis. And as we spoke about a little bit last time, Isis was the most popular deity in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. Though she was Egyptian in origin, she became incredibly popular in ancient Rome and very important in early Christian iconography. I think I mentioned last time that the image of Isis nursing Horus really becomes the basis for the image of the Madonna and Child. But here you have an image which has been destroyed and probably destroyed in the early Christian period. There's some evidence of ancient Egyptian, or in this case, Roman period Egyptian destruction of images before Christianity. But this is probably an example of early Christian image destruction. And the reason I juxtapose these two is because part of the strategy of early Christian image destruction, which is very different and is sort of a precedent for some of the conversations we're going to have about Byzantine image destruction, is that an image of a pagan deity would be destroyed and left in place. And the logic was that, and there are primary sources that talk to this point, that by showing the destroyed image, it was a reminder of who had won. Right? That when you remove an image, people forget. But when you keep a destroyed image, the act of destruction is a form of physical, as a manifestation of memory in and of itself. And that's also an important point, and something for us to keep in mind as we continue our conversations about iconoclasm in general. But so the same would have potentially been true in some instances of damnatio memoriae, right? So you see that sort of in the Severan Tondo, where the Tondo wasn't destroyed, one person was excised from it. How it was preserved is the subject of a lot of speculation. This probably was something which would have been carried in a standard and would have been given to someone very important in Egypt, a governor, a military official. So it was something which, even though the person subscribed to the damnatio memoriae, was saved nonetheless. So it shows something of how the absence of a figure, right, the erasure of a figure, lends power and lends history to an object. And its intentional destruction is sort of a physical manifestation of the loss, right, of that domain or that denomination. So, moving to the next slide. So I'm gonna do what I did last time. I'm gonna sort of read you two long texts, but I think it's important to give you a sense of the history of Christian imagery and Christian image worship. So they, the Gnostics, also possess images. So Gnostics are, let's call them apocryphal Christians, or what we call heretical Christians today, but non-Orthodox, heterodox Christians. Some of them painted and others formed from different kinds of material, while they maintained that a likeness of Christ was made by Pilate at the time when Jesus lived among them. They crowned these images and set them up along with images of the philosophers of the world, that is to say, with the images of Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and the rest. They have also other modes of honoring these images after the same manner of the Gentiles. So the point here being that Christians worshipped images from the very beginning. While we're pushing back into the 2nd century here, we're talking about verbal histories of image worship of Christ all the way back into the time of Pilate. And this is just to say that is not your traditional history of image worship in the Christian church, but to the point, people practice what they practice, right? If the Roman period featured image veneration, then early Christians would have venerated images because it was the cultural matrix in which they were immersed. And it's even more problematic as we move to the next slide. The second quote, just from 60 years later, although Jesus was only a single individual, he was nevertheless more things than one, according to the different standpoint from which he might be regarded. Nor was he seen in the same way by all those who beheld him. He did not appear in like fashion to all who saw him, but according to their several abilities to receive him. So basically, people worshipped images of Christ from almost his lifetime, right, or from his lifetime, and he could look like a bunch of different things and took a bunch of different images on. So one of the things I do my research on is ambiguity in early Christian imagery, and I'm going to show you some examples of how that is made manifest. But the important point for us here is, so if you're in the Byzantine period and you are thinking about whether you should worship images or you should not worship images, you are making this decision on the basis of a very long history of image worship already, And this is really important, you don't know what Christ looked like. There is no textual evidence that suggests what Christ's appearance looks like. None, right? So what is the basis for knowing what Christ looked like? And if you believe that an image gets its presence from its likeness, then how is it that you establish the likeness for someone whose likeness you don't know? That's an interesting question, right? So let's talk a little bit about how they did that in the remaining time that we have. Move to the next slide. So this is one of the earliest images that we have that we can definitively say depicts Christ. It dates from about 200 AD. It's from a catacomb in Rome, the catacomb of Comedilla. And here we have an image which looks an awful lot like Zeus, an awful lot like other deities, right? There is no cruciform in his halo. There's none of the standard iconography that you associate with Christ. But flanking his head, you have a Greek symbol, or Greek letter alpha, and you have another Greek letter omega. I'm the alpha omega, I'm the first and the last. So here, in exactly the same way that we see in ancient Egypt, an inscription is used, or a reference to scripture, a scriptural citation is what I call it, to make it very clear that what you are looking at is Christ. Now, this same image shows up in all sorts of examples in catacombs and other media without an alpha and omega flanking it. So is it Christ? Is it not Christ? Right? It sort of depends on the context. It depends on what other clues people left you. But if you move to the next slide, I think a lot of people would see it and they would say, yeah, that's Christ. That's what we think Christ looks like. This is an example of an icon, right? Nice, so confusing, right? And art historians call these panel portraits on wood icons. It's a 6th century image, which comes from Mount Sinai Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt. Has one of the most remarkable collections of Byzantine icons, or basically the only collection of early Byzantine icons you're likely to find. There are some, there are individual icons that are known from other places, but there are multiple of them at Mount Sinai. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see what 2 others look like. Those are images of Christ. So the image in the middle shows Christ with white hair and a white beard. He's old. We know it's Christ because he has a cruciform halo. You can vaguely make it out here. We'll see if so that will work for me. So you can see the bars of it right there in black. And if you're thinking, well, how on earth is this Christ? Well, it's probably an allusion to apocalyptic images, probably to Ezekiel. And it is called in the art historical literature the Ancient of Days, although you can make an argument it would be a better term to call him the Son of Man, for those of you who really know your biblical scholarship. And then all the way here on the right, you have this other funny looking guy and what is called the Syriac image, which incidentally, right, my point is that we don't know what Christ looked like, so there were all sorts of variable images that were in circulation at the time in very serious, very holy settings. But if you were going to say, which of these did Christ look most like, given that he was a 1st century Syriac individual, it probably would have been most like this, probably the most historically accurate. That said, this is in such bad condition relative to the others that you're just going to have to take my word for it. But he also has a cruciform halo behind his head. So here you have 3 different images of Christ, all still in circulation in the 6th century. This is a great indication that we don't have convergence on the idea of what an image of Christ is meant to represent, or how Christ is meant to look, because there is no textual evidence. But around this time, because you start to hear people starting to sort of clamor about image veneration and whether or not people should be venerating images at all in the first place, you start to see, oh, did that work? Amazing. All right. You start to see another tradition emerge. So here you see a 10th century icon, which is also in Mount Sinai, which shows a king, right? A king named Hanan, right? Hanan's the archivist. Shows a king named Abgar holding up a cloth that has an image of Christ's face on it. So raise your hand if you've heard of the Shroud of Turin. Right. So whatever you think of the Shroud of Turin, if you believe that the Shroud of Turin is in fact an image of Christ, what you actually think is that it's this. It's something called the Mandylion, which is, the Mandylion is one, the Veil of Veronica is another that some of you may have heard of. At exactly this moment in the 6th, 7th century, you start to get these stories that are being told of what in Greek, the term that's used is akropoieta, literally images not made by human hands. Images of Christ that were imprinted on cloth as they touched him. So now all of a sudden, we don't have a description of what he looked like. We don't have a painting of what he looked like. We have something even better. We have a facsimile of what he looked like. So now we have a justification for saying, we know what he looked like. Right? This is a very important point, because if you believe that the presence of something inures or inheres from its likeness, now you have an argument that you can use to stitch the two together. And in point of fact, the one thing that iconoclasm does, other than provide endless debate for scholars, sorry, I jumped to my conclusion too quickly. No, I'm going to go there anyway. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go out of order. Here's a coin showing the front and the back, the obverse and the reverse, from the reign of Justinian II. Right? Justinian II actually has two reigns. He's a very funny emperor. He reigns from 685 to 695, and then he gets thrown out, and he comes back in 705 and rules from 705 to 711. Okay? So this is a coin, a solidus, right? A gold coin that he makes during his first empire, and on the back, right, in 685 still, we see an image of that Syro-Palestinian image of Christ, right, on the back. He comes back, and in 711, the second reign, he switched his image of Christ, right? Right in the run-up to the iconoclastic debates, right? He switched his Christ back to that more canonical image of Christ. Then we hit iconoclasm, and the first solidus minted after iconoclasm is the solidus of Michael III, and it retains that canonical image, and you never see another image other than that one on Byzantine coinage for the rest of the Byzantine Empire. So what iconoclasm does is it focuses attention on the legitimacy of a single image of Christ. Now, why is that so important? Why is that the key to understanding Byzantine image worship? Well, the key is, we've already discussed the argument against image production, right? That you shall not make graven images. And in fact, the reason that graven images are so problematic, as we've discussed, is because people can't distinguish between the fact that the image is in itself holy. So here you have our 6th century image of Christ from Mount Sinai, and here you have a 2nd century image of another very important deity named Serapis. Looks pretty similar, right? This is also an Egyptian panel portrait, right? So this is arguably the origins of the icon painting tradition. And just to underscore the point that you can theoretically say, no, this image existed in a state where people thought it was alive and actually captured the spirit of the individual, right? And this one was just a pointer, a referent to the divine realm. Here's a quote from Tacitus, written in AD 100. Those who worship Serapis are, in fact, Christians. And those who call themselves bishops of Christ are, in fact, devotees of Serapis. There is no chief of the Jewish synagogue, no Samaritan, no Christian presbyter who is not an astrologer, a soothsayer, or an anointer. Even the patriarch himself, when he comes to Egypt, is forced by some to worship Serapis, by others to worship Christ. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? That someone who is observing religious practice would say that Christians are behaving in exactly the way that non-Christians are. They are worshiping images that look similar. They are practicing similar rituals. Now, this is very, very early in the history of Christianity, but it underscores the point that as you are converting to a new religion, you are importing practices that are familiar to you, that surround you, right? So it is a very difficult thing to tell someone, no, that image doesn't have the same kind of power, when that person isn't literate, right? When that person isn't well-read or well-studied, right? When that person is just doing what their neighbor does, which is so frequently the human condition. So that is sort of the crux of the matter, right? Is that theory and practice differ. But nonetheless, theory wins out, or at least theory wins out in the officially sanctioned version of Christianity, right? All the way up until, Michelangelo sculpts the Pietà, right? Now we're in the Western Empire here, and it sits in the Vatican today. And people would literally go on pilgrimage in front of that sculpture and believe that it would cure them, right? This idea, whatever your sanctioned version of religion is, you always find deviations in practice. But the reason that image worship was so important, the reason that it was worth fighting for, the reason that iconophiles felt so strongly that it was important to set the narrative straight and allow image worship, was that in their view, to deny images, and this is a really important point for our consideration in Jacksonville, to deny images was to deny the historicity, the historical authenticity of Christ. So here, they gave me gall to eat, and when I was thirsty, they gave me vinegar to drink. Christ had a physical body in Christian theology. He was literally incarnated. So if he had a physical body, it had to be circumscribable in art. You had to be able to depict an image of Christ, because if you couldn't, it was to deny the thing that made him so important, that he took on physical form, that he died to redeem all the sins of mankind. So images were not just a nice to have, they were a need to have. They were the theological battleground of establishing what made Christianity different. So while it is easy on a practical level to see how images could be conflated with that which they represent, right? Theologically speaking, images were, the way that one treats images in Christianity is exactly the reason Christianity is different. And that is why it is something, both at the imperial level and at the patriarchate level, patriarch and papal level, it was something which was reinforced and has been reinforced at this point for millennia. So, what are some of our key takeaways from our discussion of Byzantium tonight? Takeaway number one, powerful symbols will always be subject to reinterpretation. Always, always, always. You're never going to come up with an image which no one can interpret differently from you. Although a central authority does have an impact on how diverse such representations can be. So the Patriarchate in the East, the papacy in the West, they can't control whether Christ takes on different forms, right? They can't control whether people misunderstand how images are interpreted, but they can use different strategies to try and curtail the variability of types of images and the variability and types of religious practice. The theology of icons in both the Eastern and Orthodox traditions is predicated on likeness between the individual depicted and his or her physical form. This echoes, right, our Egyptian lecture, and I'm not trying to cheat you out of 4 takeaways, right? It is important that this reinforces our Egyptian takeaway. Where you see consistency across time, it means that we're onto something. We really have to understand this idea of likeness, and we need to understand how likeness manifests itself in some of the monuments that we're going to be discussing in the design charrette. Third, although the rules may be clear, when they're nuanced, that nuance can be lost in actual practice. And I didn't show you any of the texts that demonstrate that people really couldn't distinguish between the image and what the image represented. For example, there are stories of people who would pray to an image of the Virgin, and when they got sick, would peel paint off the image and mix it in with their drink and drink it, thinking that it would heal them. That is literally believing that the material of the thing has the sanctity of the individual. And we didn't take a deep dive into all of the interesting phenomena of Byzantium, because you can see, for those of you who think about, say, relics, right? How there is a notion that you can have a power of an individual, or of an individual resident in an object. So it's not a totally foreign concept, but this is really sophisticated stuff to differentiate between all of these varying, somewhat similar things. So there can be all sorts of nuance among academics, among the erudite, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it translates to the lowest level of vernacular, of practice. And that also should be something that sounds very familiar. And power is vested in images equally by alleged idolaters, iconophiles, and iconoclasts. So let me put this to you in a somewhat different way. Someone who destroys an image thinks that the image is as powerful in Byzantium as the people who pray to the image. If I pray to an icon in Byzantium, I actually don't think that image has any power. I think that that image looks like the person, and therefore it directs my prayer to that person. The image doesn't have any power. I pray to it because it points me somewhere else. If I destroy the image, then I actually think that image has power. Maybe it doesn't have power over me, it has power over other people, but it's actually the iconoclast who invests the image with power, right? So idolaters, people who legitimately scrape the paint off, right, do think the image has power, but just as much as the iconoclasts. It's actually the iconophiles who don't think the image has power. That's a really interesting thought too, right? If you want to destroy an image, you're probably the one who thinks it means what you think it means. And the person who doesn't want to destroy an image actually thinks it's pretty benign. It's a kind of radical thought, right? So what does this mean in terms of our ongoing conversation, right? This is my last slide, as always, right? I don't give you answers. I give you questions to walk away with and to think about. But I want to come back to where we started. And I want to come back to this sort of interesting tension between who thinks images have power. And we've spoken in this lecture with some technological glitches along the way, so thank you for your patience. But we've spoken in this lecture about likeness and presence. And we've spoken about how presence emerges from likeness. Now I want you to imagine, for the sake of our conversation, that likeness and presence are separated. And perhaps one way to think about this conversation going forward is, as we just saw with iconoclasts and idolaters actually both equally investing images with power, maybe, just maybe it's the case that iconoclasts are the ones who are imbuing presence into images, right? And iconophiles are the ones who view images in general as being benign because they either have or don't have likeness. So if you think about the arguments that are marshaled around Confederate sculptures like this one, which does not show a specific Confederate soldier, it is a generalized memorial to fallen Confederate soldiers. Part of the argument among those who would say that it is benign and is a reference to history and ought to stay is that it isn't an individual who did atrocious things. Because that's true. It's not. It's not an individual. It's not depicting an individual. That is true, right? But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a presence that others imbue into it. But they're not the ones who are imbuing that presence into it. So I think this notion of likeness and presence and this tension between who gets to decide whether an image has power and what side of the debate you're on, right, really resonates even through to today. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention. I see most people with open eyes, even after a glass of wine. And although I do need to run to the airport, what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow for 2 questions, and then I'm going to sprint off. But thank you all so much for being here.